understand why Jesus was born in the manger, we have to understand what happened in the beginning. So let me real quick go through what happened in the beginning, then we'll go to Abraham and Isaac. So we know how God created the earth. How many days did it take for God to create the earth? 7. It actually only took 6, but on the 7th day he rested. But you're right, there were 7 days. So on day 6 he created man. He created man in his own image. Everything looked good. God said it's very good. God rested. Everything was very good. But I think what God enjoyed the most was coming down and spending time with Adam, walking in the garden. They used to talk together, walk together. It was a perfect world. But then something happened. Does anyone know what happened? Well, it started up in heaven. A rebellion broke out up in heaven. Do you know who rebelled against God up in heaven? It was Satan. So God tossed Satan out of heaven. Poof, he landed on earth. Then Satan was mad at God. He hated God. Who was he going to pick on? He was going to pick on man who God had created. So now he came to Adam and Eve. And what did he do to Adam and Eve? He asked them questions, and he got them to disobey God by eating from the tree. And if we disobey God, that causes sin. So now that we have sin in our lives, that separates us from God, right? So Adam and God when God came down to walk with Adam, he hid himself. He was afraid. He was scared. There was sin in his life. He seen he was naked. All those things. So now that we know what happened, we know why we can understand God, we can understand mankind, we understand where sin came in. If we know the story of in the beginning, that lays the foundation for everything. But now that we're separated from God, how do we get back together? How do we reunite with God? So, remember, God said he would send a deliverer. Well, it wasn't Cain and Abel because Cain killed Abel, right? God accepted Abel's sacrifice. Cain killed him. Well, the deliverer can't be Noah and the flood. Noah can't save us with a big boat because God said, I won't never send another flood. So we're not going to get killed by water. But maybe in this story, you'll find a clue how God's going to save us. So we'll get right into it. It's in chapter 22, and it says, and it came to pass that after these things that God did tempt Abraham. And he called out to Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. So that's an interesting verse. God did tempt Abraham. And after these things, after what things? Well, if you know the story of Abraham, which we've been studying the last while, God has been working with Abraham for 50-some years already. And after all these things, he called unto him. And I don't know, some of you maybe remember when I went through this story last time, I took a little red car and I drove it off of the pulpit. And you remembered it landed on the ground and it broke into a bunch of pieces. So the way I explained it that time is God was testing Abraham, but you remember we have Satan down here too trying to find the bad part in us. So what I was trying to do with that car, if the car dealership makes a car and they want to test this car, and if this car is strong and survives and makes through, like they crash it into a wall, and if the car doesn't get damaged, if it only gets a little dent up front and it's safety rated, a lot of people buy those cars because it'll keep their family safe. So you have to test something to see how strong it is. And if the car is strong, everyone claps and wants that car, wants to be like Abraham. But if the car is weak, and you remember that car that I had some squeaky tires and a broken windshield. The squeaky tires were the time that Abraham lied. So we take that car and we fix the tires, make that tire stronger so next time it wouldn't break. So God was doing this all after these things, after all this testing in Abraham's life. God said, I think Abraham's ready for this big test. This is where Abraham is. Everyone wants to be like Abraham after this test. So here was the rules. Here was the test. He said, take thine son, thy only son who you love. Take him up to Mount Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains that I will tell you. So this was at night. So early the next morning, Abraham knew what God told him to do, and Abraham did not waste any time. So early the next morning, Abraham got up. He took 2 of his servants, he saddled his donkeys, and he took his only son, and they started toward the mountain that God was going to show them. And as they walked along, it was a 3-day journey. On the 3rd day, God said, there's the mountain that I want you to climb. Up there, that's the mountain. So Abraham came to the foot of that mountain, and he told his 2 servants, he said, guys, you just stay behind with the donkeys. Me and Isaac are going to, let's see, I got to make sure I get this right because this is a prophecy. He said, Abide ye here with the donkeys, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. That's interesting. God told him to go up on the mountain and sacrifice his son. But Abraham said, I'll come. We will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood, put it on his son. He had the knife in his belt, and they started up this mountain. Isaac had seen many times his father make a burnt offering, and there was always an animal offered up. So as they were going up this journey, Isaac asked his dad, he said, Dad, we have the wood, we have a fire, we have the knife, but where is the lamb? And then again, Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. So the both of them went together. So here again, we see that Abraham prophesied, and I'll bring that up a little bit later about that prophecy. So when they came to the place that God showed them, they went all the way up to the top of the mountain, exactly where God wanted them. Now they're all the way up top, and Abraham does what he did before. He builds an altar out of stone. He puts the wood on, getting everything ready. And all of a sudden, he tells his son Isaac that God told me that I have to offer you up as a burnt offering today. Imagine how Isaac trusted his dad, that he just that he didn't run down the hill and run away. They had a great relationship. He trusted his dad and God that something good would become of this. So he laid him down and he took his knife. He was going to do exactly what God had told him to do, to slay his only son. And as he was concentrated to kill his son, all of a sudden, an angel of the Lord said, Abraham, Abraham. Abraham stopped. And he said, lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withhold thine only son from me. And then Abraham picked up his eye. He was so concentrated looking at his son and not wanting to hurt him and make the right cut, that when God spoke to him, he lifted up his eyes and he seen a ram caught in the bushes. So he said, I'll just sacrifice the lamb instead of my son. So he got his son off, and they bent over, untangled the ram, and then they laid the ram on the sacrifice and offered up the ram instead of Isaac. So So now, remember when they were walking up the hill and Abraham prophesied that God will provide a lamb? Can you guys tell me what the difference is between a lamb and a ram? Was Abraham back to his old ways of lying? What is the difference between these two animals? A ram has horns and he's an adult. So was Abraham lying, or was he talking about a different time maybe? Is there any other time that on this mountain that a lamb would be sacrificed, like years later? Maybe if we read in the New Testament and we found out that Mount Moriah was also called Golgotha or Calvary, does that ring a bell to anyone? What happened on Calvary? We'd say 2,000 years ago. Jesus was crucified, but how can we tie that in with the lamb? Was Jesus sometime called the lamb that takes away the sin of the world? Right? So here they were trying to take away their sin, and he prophesied that years later, this lamb, and I think it was definitely on the same mountain range, and I would say it's very close to the same spot that God was trying to show all this. Because what he says right after that, he says, then God started talking to Abraham again. Actually, after Abraham offered up the ram, he said, I'm going to call this place Jehovah Jireh, as it says in the day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Well, there was no one there to see that except them two. But in the mount of the Lord, when Jesus would be sacrificed, a lot of people would see that lamb. There was a lot of people looking on when Jesus was offered up. So what I want to bring out in this story, and actually it applies to what happened a lot to me this last week. When we look at how God tests Abraham, Abraham was in a hard place. I am sure this mountain was the hardest mountain Abraham ever climbed. There are higher mountains that you can go out west, like Mount Everest or some of those, and physically they're harder to climb than Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah isn't very high. But if you think why Abraham was climbing this mountain, God was putting him to the test to see if he was faithful. And through this test, what man lost in the garden, the fellowship with God, here God was talking with Abraham and telling him what to do. After he named this place Jehovah Jireh, it says, the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham out of heaven the second time. So he was talking with Abraham. He said, in blessing I will bless thee, in multiplying I will multiply thee as the seed. I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven and the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies. Jesus' seed possesses the gates of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So if God tells us to do something, even though it looks hard and we're sure it's from God, we just need to obey. If Adam wouldn't have disobeyed, we wouldn't need a Savior. Jesus wouldn't have had to die that awful death. But now, because we're in this place, God puts tests to us to see how strong we are. Does anyone remember the story of the 3 Hebrew slaves, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? You remember? They had to bow down to King Nebuchadnezzar. Did they bow down? No. Where did they end up if they didn't bow down? In a big fiery furnace. But when King Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fiery furnace, he said, didn't only 3 men go in there? It looks like there's 4 in there. He looks like Jesus. He looks like the Son of Man. So what I'm trying to say is, through the trials and the tests that we go down through here on this earth, we feel closest to God. Because in that fire, it was so hot, the soldiers fell down outside. The 3 Hebrew slaves could have walked out and no one would have poked them back in because it was so hot. But in the fire, they were close to Jesus. And that's where they stayed until Nebuchadnezzar said, "Come out." So we think, why would God call him to kill his son? God had a plan, wanted to show us something in this story. And sometimes we think, why would God let our house burn down? But through that, how else will God show us love if, God's invisible. But if we say we love God, through that, we can love other people. And I tell you, it has really changed my perspective on life to see people come together and care and love each other how they have been this past week. And even though it's hard to see Donnie and Sarah without a home, to see how they're trusting God and how God's providing for us. No, I don't want my other house to burn down, but it's amazing, right? So what we can learn out of this story and out of Abraham, what I want you children to remember is 3 things: faith, hope, and love. Those are the most 3 important things you kids have to learn in your life growing up to trust God. And in Abraham's story, we can read those 3 things. Let's start in Hebrews 11:8. So faith is number 1 that we see. When God called Abraham, it says, by faith, when he was called to go out into a place that he should receive after inheritance, what did he do? He obeyed and he went out. But he didn't know where he went. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just trusted God. So there's a lot of times through this past week where I didn't know what was going to happen the next day. And like Elmer said, my mind wouldn't rest at night. I couldn't sleep because we try to figure everything out. What's the plan for tomorrow? And then if we just do what God says and we just trust in God, he provides. And that's what Abraham did. So now, but we say there's no hope. How can we go on? So if we have faith in something, we can place our hope in it. And Abraham, it says in Romans 4:18, who against hope believed in hope that he might become the father of many nations. Remember, Abraham was old when he had Isaac. Have you guys ever seen an old grandpa holding a little baby? Maybe his grandson, but not his own little baby. But with God, all things are possible. Abraham believed God because he staggered not at the promise through unbelief. But before you can have that, it says you have to be fully persuaded that what he has promised, he's able to perform. You can't have hope in something if you don't fully trust that God's going to do it. Abraham would not have been able to take his son up there, and Isaac would not have nicely laid on that altar if they wouldn't have trusted God. So now the last thing is love. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, the greatest of these 3 is love. So what did God say? Take your son, your only son, whom thou lovest. And in this, we see that's exactly why is the greatest thing love? Because God is love. And he wants to show all you guys that he loves you. And that's why Jesus died for us. So I thank everyone, the church and everyone for just providing for our family and showing love. I don't know how else God would show love if it wouldn't be for, Donnie called me that night and he said, Reuben, the house is on fire. And as I was going down, I was thinking, it doesn't matter if the house burns down. Donnie's safe. The house can be rebuilt. And we just all got together and we can love each other. And it's just a good time. So I wanted you guys to love each other and go through this life with faith, hope, and then you can show love. So we'll end it there and go on next week to show how Jesus showed his love next week.